For 2 centuries, the sun never set on the British Empire. That's what the history books say. A tale of red-mapped glory, global dominance, the gentle diffusion of tea and railways and parliamentary democracy. An empire built by explorers, defended by the navy, sustained by clever administrators. But here's the thing nobody ever admits. Empires are not built on ideals. They are built on systems that extract value, ruthlessly, relentlessly, from millions of people far beyond the imperial core. You know the names: India, Malaysia, the West Indies, Kenya, Australia, Egypt. But what you probably don't know is that beneath every surface story of conquest and civilization was a cold calculus. Of profit and loss, trees and ships, taxes and trade balances, families evicted, entire industries broken, currencies manipulated, and laws bent to serve one purpose: to turn distant resources into streams of money that poured into London and never stopped. The British Empire was not a romantic adventure. It was the most sophisticated expropriation machine in modern history. To understand the economics of the British Empire, you have to strip away nostalgia and confront the hard mechanics that made domination pay. This isn't about glory, this is about cash, credit, insurance, and logistics. Because the British weren't the biggest, nor the bloodiest. They were the most economically inventive. At its core, the empire was a 20-generation experiment in scaling extraction. The colonies were not accidental acquisitions. They were engineered engines, each with a role, a purpose, a price tag, and a vulnerability. India was for textiles and opium, the West Indies for sugar and slaves, Malaya for rubber and tin, Australia and Canada for wheat and gold. Each possession was a node in a global value chain, and every node's true worth was measured not in loyalty, but in the margin between the cost of control and the price fetched on global exchange. That's why, for every fort hoisted and parliament installed, there was a complicated network of companies, agencies, joint stock banks, underwriters and insurers, customs and excises, tariffs and subsidies, taxes and rents. The empire's real legacy isn't cultural. It's the world's first multinational financial-industrial complex. How does this machine actually run? Start with extraction, the obvious first layer. By the late 18th century, India alone was producing £13 million a year in direct revenues for the British government, a sum that covered nearly half the entire operating cost of the British state at home. Cotton, tea, indigo, opium. Crops engineered for European markets. In Bengal, after conquest, land taxes were hiked to nearly 50% of gross agricultural output. That pressure was designed, not accidental. A fiscal pump that exported profits across the seas via the East India Company, the original too-big-to-fail corporation, chartered with powers of war, justice, and money issuance. Its annual dividends made up 15% of the London Stock Exchange by 1800. But extraction wasn't enough. To create outsized returns, you need to engineer dependency. The empire did it by systematically destroying competing industries in the periphery and reserving high-value processing for the core. Indian textiles were world-class, so British tariffs and outright bans destroyed home spinning and weaving. By 1830, Manchester was thriving, its mills feeding on Indian cotton, while Indian towns hollowed. Cotton cloth exports from Britain rose from just 40 million yards in 1815 to 2 billion by 1850. The global trade deficit that had once drained silver from London to the east now ran in reverse. In fact, the term drain of wealth was coined in India to describe the forced transfer of $45 trillion in wealth from colony to metropole, in today's money, over just 2 centuries. Meanwhile, shipping and insurance were revolutionized to fit the task. Lloyd's of London, founded in a coffee house in the age of expansion, made fortunes by pooling risk for imperial merchants. The Bank of England, originally a wartime lender, became the heart of global clearing. By 1914, nearly 60% of the world's cross-border payments cleared in sterling. The British Navy was the muscle behind the merchant's ledger. Piracy or blockade could erase profits overnight, so Britain funded the largest fleet on Earth, at one point spending 25% of all government revenue just to rule the seas. But what powered the system beyond gunpowder and guile was debt. Every war of conquest, from the 7 Years' War to the Opium Wars to the Boer War, was financed not by existing wealth, but by future promises, government bonds, insured cargoes, and the confidence that empire gained profits would cover the interest. By 1817, British national debt stood at £846 million, over 250% of GDP, but investors, from London to Amsterdam, eagerly bought in because imperial revenues promised not just repayment, but a state-backed yield. The logic was brutal. As long as the perimeter held, creditors got paid. If the perimeter broke, the house of cards would crumble. If you look behind the familiar institutions of empire, Parliament, the monarchy, the venerable city of London, you find a more pragmatic mechanism. Charters, monopolies, cutthroat contracts. The East India Company at its height appointed its own governors, employed its own armies, over 250,000 men by 1857, and minted its own currency. The British government did not build roads or schools for an abstract mission. It built them to move commodities, extract taxes, and crush revolts. Every mile of Indian railway laid was mapped first for British troop movement and export efficiency. The Suez Canal wasn't constructed for the world, it was a 19th-century leverage buyout, 44% of shares bought in secrecy with borrowed French gold, just to drop the journey from London to Bombay by 6,000 miles and have insurance. Every colonial policy was about margin. In the West Indies, sugar plantations became debt factories. Slave traders issued credit for stock, refiners advanced cash for future harvests, and absentee landlords in England squeezed every penny by extending sharkish loans. Slavery was abolished not from sudden conscience but from changing economics. By the 1830s, Caribbean sugar was outcompeted by beet sugar and cheaper labor elsewhere, so Parliament paid £20 million, 40% of the entire annual budget, to compensate slave owners, not former slaves. The cost was floated in government bonds. The freed slaves, for their part, were forced to enter the labor market at starvation rates, now as free workers but still bound by forced contracts and cash rents. The land stayed with the planters. The profits sailed home. But perhaps the greatest trick the empire ever pulled was to outsource operating risk to others. Joint stock companies, like the British South Africa Company and Hudson's Bay Company, were imperial risk managers. They could go bankrupt, be scapegoated, or shed territories when losses mounted. The East India Company's disastrous governance of Bengal led to famine and bankruptcy in 1772. But instead of a reckoning, Parliament bailed it out and nationalized its debts. Liability was socialized, profit privatized. It's the oldest play in the imperial corporate book. As the Industrial Revolution accelerated, the empire morphed into a global system of forced trade and regulatory capture. Colonial ports became choke points, tariffs set to favor British-manufactured goods, cheap raw materials flooded in. By 1913, over 40% of British exports went just to the colonies and Informal empire. Those countries coerced to adopt sterling and British law without a flag planted. In India, the rupee was pegged to silver, while the pound operated on gold, each monetary shock engineered to preserve London's advantage in global capital. When local industries threatened to rise, regulations snuffed them out. The British Raj's salt laws blocked Indian salt making, turning a basic good into a taxable monopoly. There was nothing accidental in the architecture of control. The great imperial railways weren't designed to connect colonized people to new markets. Their rails radiated from mines, fields, and ports, mapping resource flows, not communities. In Africa, cash crop agriculture was forced through price controls, tax requirements, and vagrancy laws. Growing cocoa and groundnuts wasn't just encouraged, it was compulsory. While Victorian speechwriters lectured about civilizing mission, colonial treasuries pinched every penny, forcing colonies to run surpluses that were remitted straight back to London. Let's take Nigeria as an example. By 1914, Nigeria's entire government revenue was less than £2 million a year, yet nearly 25% was siphoned to pay back loans issued by London banks to build harbors and railroads. Investments designed to increase cocoa and palm oil exports, not local welfare. This pattern was global. Colonies borrowed from British banks at above-market rates, paid with interest remitted to the city, their export earnings held in sterling reserves, effectively trapped savings financing British deficits and wars. Behind every imperial narrative of order and progress was another kind of order, one enforced by credit, merchant marine law, gunboats, and capital controls. The British didn't always need to own a territory outright to profit. In Argentina, Brazil, Egypt, and China, the informal empire system deployed gunboat diplomacy and capital leverage, compelling governments to take on British-backed debt, build British lending-funded railroads, and denominate their foreign trade in sterling. When Egypt defaulted in 1876, British forces occupied Cairo overnight, seizing the Suez Canal and cementing imperial control for the next 70 years. Curiously, control was always a balancing act between cost and risk. Administering vast territories was expensive. In most colonies, total staff counts never exceeded a few thousand British nationals. In India, the steel frame of about 1,000 civil servants ruled over 300 million people by delegating power to local princes, landowners, and compradors, who were rewarded just enough to keep the system running, but never enough to threaten London's ultimate authority. In settler colonies like Canada and Australia, the model shifted again. These white dominions were given home rule and cheap land, but were locked into the imperial economy by capital flows, mortgage debt, and military alliances. The mother country remained the lender of last resort. But for all its cunning, the economics of empire contained the seeds of its collapse. The system was fragile, addicted to global flows and ever-increasing leverage. The colonies were forced customers for British goods, but as new competitors industrialized Germany, the US, Japan, the premium faded. Running such a vast bureaucracy became unsustainable. Defense costs ballooned. The two world wars exposed the limits of imperial finance. The British state emerged from World War I with debts of over £7.5 billion, 10 times national income. London's balance of payments broke. To maintain the system, the empire sacrificed its gold reserves to defend the pound, but in 1931, the cost became too high, the pound went off gold. Suddenly, the myth of endless imperial wealth shattered. And yet, the old habits of extraction did not die so much as mutate. After World War II, independence came, but the real economic levers remained. Sterling area rules, Commonwealth trade preferences, military bases, London listings for colonial commodity companies. Debt burdens laid by colonial authorities became the post-colonial inheritance. The parallel empire of banks, insurers, brokers, commodity traders, and expatriate landlords went nowhere. If independence meant self-rule, it often began with a fiscal noose. In 1947, India started life with less than $1 billion in reserves, much of it held in the Bank of England, while the country owed over £1.3 billion to British creditors. The core logic endures. The City of London, built on the cash extracted by imperial monopolies, remains a global money whirlpool, a place where more money is traded every day than the entire GDP of most former colonies. London's obscure offshore network, 30 dependencies from Jersey to the Cayman Islands, still shield capital flows, many with roots in the rules written for the old imperial trade. The economic laws that once funneled profits from Malaya, Kenya, Nigeria, and Australia still shape private equity, raw commodity trades, and shipping insurance. The British Empire was never just a symbol of military might or cultural superiority. It was an operating system for global wealth transfer. Its accountants, shippers, and lawyers were as crucial as its admirals. Its power was not in the number of flags it planted, but in the cash flows, contracts, margins, and hidden costs that redistributed the world's energy, minerals, land, and human labor toward a single capital. When it broke, it was less a military defeat than a credit event, a global margin call that left new nations independent in name, but still trapped in old networks of debt and dependency. And so, the next time you picture the British Empire, forget the pageantry, the stiff upper lip, the railways, and tea parties. Remember the real mechanism. A centuries-long money machine, precision engineered to move resources uphill, from the many to the few, rebalancing at every turn to maintain that margin. Beneath every enduring institution, Parliament, the city, the railroads, the navy, was a subledger of everything taken, owed, shipped, hypothecated, and insured. That ledger is the real map of empire. The only line that mattered was the one at the bottom. Profit. That's the economic engine history tries hardest to forget. Power endures when it becomes invisible. But follow the money, and the logic of empire is always hiding just beneath the surface, waiting to be recognized for what it truly was. The ultimate business model.